Hello and welcome to a new session in our slat7001 course. This week we will keep our focus on the language learning that takes place in instructional settings, that is to say, in the classroom. Accordingly, we will explore different approaches that aim to promote language learning in the classroom. So today, we will be focusing on 3 of a total of 6 proposals that have been advanced in relation to L2 learning. The first of these proposals is the get it right from the beginning perspective, which characterizes structure-based approaches such as the grammar translation method. Under the just listen and read premise, we will learn more about language teaching methods that rely on the hypothesis that language acquisition takes place when learners are exposed to comprehensible inputs. In today's session, we will also be discussing the Let's Talk approaches, which highlights the importance of access to both comprehensible inputs and conversational interactions in the classroom for a successful L2 learning process. Let's get started now. Before getting into the actual discussion of today's topic, I would like to invite you to reflect on the L2 language learning hypothesis and teaching approaches we have studied so far. Please pause the recording now and take some minutes to think about this. I believe that you probably thought of the input hypothesis, or perhaps the interaction hypothesis, or maybe the outputs hypothesis, and how the tenets advanced in this series attempt to explain L2 learning. Now, if you had to write a recipe for a successful language teaching approach, what elements would you include? As you probably realized in the previous reflection activity, it is not easy to think of a list of aspects or ingredients that would make a language teaching approach successful. There are certainly many theories, but what's the best way to learn an L2 in the classroom? How can we actually assess a proposal? Well, answers to this type of questions are usually informed by research, either quantitative or qualitative, which can help us have a better understanding of the relationship between teaching and learning. So let's start examining proposals for L2 teaching. As mentioned earlier in the lecture, the get it right from the beginning premise describes structure-based approaches such as the grammar translation method. The grammar translation method is a foreign language teaching methodology based on explicit instruction in the grammatical analysis of the target language. Classes are taught in the student's mother tongue with little active use of the target language. Vocabulary is taught in the form of isolated word lists with elaborate explanations of grammar always provided. The method has its origin in the teaching of classical languages, and the goal was for students to be able to read literature, ideally in the original language in which these classical books had been written. A class in a grammar translation method would typically include translation of sentences from the native language into the target language and vice versa. Please follow the link at the bottom of the slide to see an example of a typical translation exercise in a classroom inspired by the grammar translation method. Now, audiolingual instruction is a kind of instruction that emphasizes the formation of habits through the repetition, practice, and memorization of patterns in isolation. So, there's no real context for meaningful use of the language. Language patterns are introduced or taught in decontextualized situations. This method emerged as a reaction to grammar translation methods, and it attempts to teach learners to speak the language rather than learn grammar rules. In the grammar translation method, there was no attempt to work with the phonetic aspect of the language. Thus, the audiolingual method is an attempt to emphasize the oral aspects of the learning of a language. The audiolingual method is based on behaviorism that argues for the formation of habits through repetition and memorization. Now, what has research found out about these teaching approaches? Well, research shows that some students prefer these form-based approaches, especially those who have good metalinguistic knowledge. Both approaches, the grammar translation and the audiolingual methods, have been shown to be beneficial for certain aspects. For example, grammar translation is good for learning grammar and vocabulary. Meanwhile, the audiolingual method that focuses on listening and speaking is beneficial for adult learners who have high motivation and learn the target language in an intensive program. However, research has also shown that these approaches have failed to help our learners develop fluency and accuracy, which eventually led to the development of the communicative approaches. In other words, learners who receive audiolingual or grammar translation instruction are often unable to communicate their messages and intentions effectively in a second language. Let us move into the next approach. This is called just listen and read. So the premise underlying this perspective throughout learning is that learners make progress if exposure to understandable language is sufficient. The associated teaching approach is the comprehension-based instruction. This is a general term to describe a variety of second language programs in which the focus of interaction is in comprehension rather than production. An example of these types of methods is TPR method, or total physical response, where instructors give commands to students with body movements in the target language, and students respond with whole body actions. You can have an example of this type of instruction if you follow the link. The underlying theory to this methodological approach to L2 learning is the input hypothesis, which postulates that a second language is acquired by receiving comprehensible input. Well, now, what does our research tell us about this approach? Well, indeed, research has shown us that our learners can make considerable progress by having constant exposure to language they understand. Certain lexical expansion can be promoted through reading activities. At the same time, input can indeed expose learners to positive evidence. That is to say, it can present them with language data which will tell them, learners, what constructions are permitted in the language. However, it will not provide learners with evidence of what is not acceptable in the target language. In addition to this, research has also shown us the importance of interaction for the learning or the acquisition of a second language. Because of this, comprehension-based learning is possible, best seen as a very valuable resource to begin learning, and possibly as a supplement to other kinds of learnings for more advanced learners. Now let's look at the Let's Talk proposal. How is it different from the previous proposals? The Let's Talk proposal focuses on developing learner production skills instead of receptive skills. It considers both comprehensible input and conversation interaction as important for second language acquisition. Given the focus on communication, the Let's Talk approach suggests that there should be genuine exchanges of information during communication. During these genuine instances of communication, learners may negotiate for meaning, which in turn may result in the provision of feedback and modified input. These interaction features, according to the interaction hypothesis and the output hypothesis, will facilitate the development of second language acquisition. Now, what does the research tell us regarding the Let's Talk approaches? First, research shows that students that are engaged more in negotiation of meaning, or they use more interactional features, provide evidence of further language developments. Thus, negotiation for meaning is important and is better than no negotiation for meaning. Also, research suggests that learners tend to talk more when they talk to their peers rather than to their teacher or native speakers. In order to help learners develop more through interaction, research has shown that interaction can be manipulated. For example, lower proficiency learners can be assigned a more dominant role to encourage them to contribute and interact more with their partners. In addition, pairs of learners that demonstrate expert novice or collaborative interactional patterns are most likely to develop as opposed to dominant or dominant passive pairs. An example of teaching approaches based on the Let's Talk proposal is the communicative language teaching, and a recent version of this approach, communicative language teaching, is task-based language teaching approach, or TBLT. The TBLT is a language teaching approach that engages learners in problem-solving tasks and activities and introduces new language relevant to successful task completion. The TBLT is organized around tasks, which are the central unit to this approach. But what is a task? Well, now, depending on research purposes, tasks have been defined differently. Some of the common features of the tasks are that, for example, it involves a primary focus on meaning. It also has some kind of information gap, and participants choose the linguistic resources needed to complete the task. And most importantly, the task should have a clearly defined outcome. The main assumption of the TBLT approach is that learners' engagement in tasks in which they work collaboratively to attain mutually agreed outcomes will lead them to use appropriate language for the task. As a result of such language use in genuine, purposeful communicative activities, learners will gradually internalize the knowledge and skills systems required for comprehension and production of the second language. Now, why is it useful to apply TBLT in second language teaching? It is suggested that tasks can be easily related to students' real-life needs. It also creates contexts that facilitate second language acquisition. That is, the second language is best learned through communication. Apart from practicing communicating or communication, tasks create opportunities for focusing on language forms. And finally, the students are more likely to develop intrinsic motivation in task-based approach. Today, we reviewed 3 proposals for second language teaching. The Get It Right from the Beginning proposal, Listen and Read, and Let's Talk. For each proposal, we described a specific teaching approach. For example, under the Get It Right from the Beginning approach, we discussed the grammar translation and the audiolingual methods. For the Listen and Read perspective, we examined the comprehension-based approach. And finally, for the Let's Talk proposal, TBLT and communicative language teaching were introduced. We hope that this brief overview of some teaching approaches will serve as starting points for you to choose which approach may fit your particular teaching context. And as you probably realized during the session today, it might not be necessary or even desirable to choose from or between form-based and meaning-based instruction. The challenge appears to be finding the best balance between these two orientations. Finally, we leave you with some questions for further consideration and reflection. Please bring your opinions and answers to the tutorial, as we will use them as inputs in the active learning activities in next week's session. Thank you for listening, and looking forward to seeing you